At exactly 1942 local Palace time, every security feed inside the oligarch's capital residence switched to a single camera. His own. Across 1,000 crystal halls and mirrored chambers, music cut off mid-note. Servants froze. Guests turned in confusion as towering holodisplays flickered once, then showed the face of House Velarin's most powerful lord staring back at himself. He was seated, unarmed, alive, and standing just behind his chair was a human woman the Empire had already forgotten. That was the moment the galaxy's assumptions about grief began to fail. Years earlier, no one had noticed her at all. She stood among a thin crowd in the outer district tribunal, hands folded, posture straight, face composed to the point of stillness. The air smelled of ozone and incense, alien custom meant to signify order and legitimacy. Her partner knelt at the center of the chamber. He was a traitor. Licensed. Registered. Human. Guilty of nothing more than refusing a price demanded by House Velarin during a shipping dispute. The oligarch's advocate spoke calmly about economic sabotage and dishonored contracts. The words sounded rehearsed. The sentence was delivered without emotion. The execution was swift. Not brutal. Not hidden. Just final. She did not scream. She did not collapse. She did not beg. That disappointed them. The Velarin expected humans to break loudly. To plead. To make scenes. Their records described humans as emotionally fragile, prone to instability when confronted with loss. But the widow, her name never entered their files, simply watched. She memorized everything. The cadence of the oligarch's voice. The way the guard stood. The ritual phrases spoken afterward, absolving the house of wrongdoing. When it was over, she bowed, because custom demanded it, and walked out alone. House Velarin marked the incident closed. That was their first mistake. The galaxy treated grief like a sickness. Friends urged her to move on. To accept compensation she never asked for. To remember that humans were guests in greater systems, and that sometimes injustice was simply the cost of participation. She listened. She nodded. She did none of it. Instead, she vanished. For a while, rumors followed her. Fringe stations. Dead-end routes. A human woman working cargo jobs no one else wanted. People said she drank too much. Or talked to herself. Or had lost her mind. House Velarin heard none of it. Humans, after all, did not hold grudges well. That assumption would be corrected later. She found the mercenaries on the edge of lawful space, operating out of a rusting orbital platform that smelled like recycled air and old violence. The group called themselves Black Helix. Veterans, outcasts, specialists who had survived enough wars to stop believing in banners. They didn't ask her name when she arrived. Just what she could do. Learn, she said. They laughed. Then they trained her. She learned to shoot, not wildly, but patiently. She learned how to move quietly, how to read alien body language, how to wait without fidgeting. She learned restraint before aggression. The mercenaries expected rage. What they found instead was control. She never spoke about her past. Never explained why she trained long after exhaustion should have stopped her. Never asked for special treatment. Grief became discipline, and discipline became precision. Years passed. Her hands grew steady. Her eyes learned to see what others missed. She became reliable in a way that frightened people who mistook emotional depth for instability. House Velarin did not notice her name crossing minor mercenary reports. They would have laughed if they had. The escalation came quietly. She began to ask questions. Not about weapons or troop movements, but about reputation. About how House Velarin maintained its power. About which crimes were hidden and which were flaunted. The answers unsettled her comrades. Killing him would be easy, one mercenary said during a briefing. Expensive, but easy. She shook her head. Then it ends with a monument, she replied. And nothing changes. She studied how the oligarch appeared in public. How he relied on ceremony, on perception, on being untouchable. How his authority depended on the belief that consequences did not apply to him. That belief was his real shield. And it was fragile. The plan took shape slowly. No explosions. No assassination. No spectacle of blood. Instead, exposure. A confession no one could bury. A moment where power unraveled itself in front of witnesses. The mercenaries argued. Mercy made them uneasy. This felt incomplete. Dangerous. She listened. Then said calmly, "If I kill him, he dies powerful. If I spare him, he lives broken." They agreed to help. That decision sealed their fates. The palace of House Velerin rose like a gemstone above its capital world. Layered security, adaptive surveillance, political paranoia made architectural. It was designed to repel armies. It was not designed to stop patience. She entered as a technician attached to a ceremonial broadcast crew. Human workers were common enough to be ignored. Emotional. Replaceable. Background noise. She moved through halls where she once would not have been allowed to stand. She passed guards who never looked her in the eye. That suited her. Each step was controlled. Measured. Not driven by rage, but guided by memory. When the ceremony began, she was already inside the heart of the palace. When the music reached its peak, she reached the control node. At exactly 19:42, she pressed a single command. And every screen turned inward. The oligarch realized too late that something was wrong. His image filled the chamber, larger than life, framed in gold and authority. Guests murmured. Security hesitated, confused by orders that did not arrive. He tried to stand. A human hand rested lightly on his shoulder. Not threatening. Not violent. Present. "Sit," she said quietly. He did. For the first time in his life, the oligarch of House Velerin obeyed without being commanded. That was where Act I ended. With the Empire watching. With the widow finally seen. And with House Velerin about to learn that humans are not fragile because they feel deeply. They are dangerous because they remember. The palace did not erupt into chaos right away. That surprised her. For several long seconds after she stepped away from the oligarch's chair, the grand hall remained frozen, guests half-risen, servants caught mid-step, guards gripping weapons they could no longer use. The Empire had been trained for violence, for explosions, for screaming alarms. It had not been trained for exposure. The widow walked calmly through the center aisle as the broadcast continued to stream. Her footsteps echoed softly against polished stone that had once been scrubbed with the blood of dissenters. No one tried to stop her. Not because they couldn't. Because no one knew how. Behind her, the oligarch of House Velerin sat motionless, his power stripped layer by layer until only the truth remained. His confession had not been elegant. It had not been complete. But it had been enough. It always was. Across the Empire, reactions cascaded faster than any military response could. Financial markets froze. Trade partners suspended contracts mid-cycle. Lesser houses scrambled to distance themselves from Velerin insignia they had proudly displayed only hours earlier. Power, she had learned, was never as solid as it pretended to be. It only held as long as people believed in it. The imperial ultimatum arrived as she reached the inner transit chamber. Stern. Efficient. Devoid of emotion. Surrender immediately. Broadcast will be terminated. Justice will be administered. Asterisk asterisk. She read it once. Then deleted it. The mercenaries had done their part. Every escape corridor was open. Every delay bought. They had vanished like ghosts into maintenance routes that imperial architects had never bothered to seal. Now it was just her. That had always been the plan. She stopped beneath a towering hollow statue of Velerin's founder, an alien carved in flawless symmetry, eyes lifted toward an imagined future where consequence did not apply. She looked up at it. "Your house ends here," she said quietly, though no one nearby dared interrupt. The statue, of course, did not answer. Imperial troops breached the outer hall moments later. They moved with terrifying precision, black armor, synchronized steps, weapons calibrated to disable rather than kill. The Empire wanted her alive. Alive meant controllable. Alive meant erasable. She turned as they entered. Hands empty. Posture relaxed. Face calm. A commander stepped forward, visor reflecting her image back at her. "You are under Imperial arrest," he announced. "Any further resistance will be—" "I am not resisting," she replied evenly. That gave him pause. "You will submit," he corrected. She smiled faintly. "No." The soldiers raised their weapons. She did not flinch. Because the broadcast was still live. Every movement, every hesitation, every flicker of uncertainty played out across the Empire in real time. "Do it," she said, her voice carrying clearly. "In front of everyone." The commander hesitated. That hesitation mattered. Behind the scenes, the oligarch's world was collapsing faster than the Empire could contain it. House Veleran's rivals pounced immediately, leaking corroborating evidence, frozen transactions, internal communications they had quietly hoarded for years but never dared release. Justice, she knew, rarely arrived alone. It came when fear finally shifted direction. Inside the palace, the oligarch screamed at aides who no longer answered. His personal channels returned only silence or polite refusals. He understood then. She had not come to destroy him. She had come to leave him alive inside the wreckage. That realization hurt more than any execution ever could. The Imperial commander lowered his weapon by a fraction. "Stand down," he ordered his unit quietly. The soldiers obeyed, not because they sympathized with her, but because the situation had become politically radioactive. Killing her now would not end the story. It would immortalize it. "Escort her," the commander said tightly. "No force." As they moved her through the palace, whispers followed. Some fearful. Some odd. Some dangerously hopeful. A human servant met her eyes briefly as she passed. The servant nodded. That single gesture struck her harder than any blow. They brought her back before the oligarch one last time. He stood now, robes disheveled, face drawn, eyes darting as if expecting walls to collapse inward. "You've ruined everything," he spat when he saw her. She regarded him without hatred. "No," she said. "You did that." Imperial representatives moved to separate them. She raised a hand. "One final thing," she said calmly. "For the record." They hesitated. Allowed it. She turned back to the cameras, still rolling, because no one had yet dared to cut them. "I came here with a choice," she said. "I could have killed him. I was trained well enough. I was angry enough." She paused. "I chose not to." The Empire leaned in. "I choose mercy," she continued. "Not because he deserves it, but because he does not deserve escape." The oligarch recoiled as if struck. She stepped closer, voice low enough that only he could hear. "You will live knowing everyone sees you now," she said. "Every day. Every breath." She stepped away. And with that, the confession ended. The Empire detained her for exactly 47 hours. Not in a cell. In a holding suite. Comfortable. Controlled. Monitored. They questioned her endlessly. "Who helped you? How did you bypass security? What is your political objective?" She answered only what mattered. "I wanted the truth heard." "That's not a strategy," one interrogator said. She met his gaze. "It worked." They had no reply. Outside, the fallout intensified. House Veleran was dissolved by emergency decree. Assets seized. Titles revoked. Allies disavowed with desperate speed. The oligarch himself was placed under protective custody, a polite word for eternal disgrace. The Empire issued statements condemning corruption while carefully avoiding her name. It did not help. The galaxy had already named her. They released her quietly. No charges. No apology. No acknowledgement. She was escorted to a civilian transport and told, politely, never to return to core space. She agreed. As the ship lifted off, she watched the palace shrink beneath her, once a symbol of invulnerability, now just another building haunted by memory. She felt no triumph, only release. She returned to the fringe. To the mercenaries who had waited, pretended not to worry, pretended not to care. They said nothing at first. Then one of them raised a glass. "To the most terrifying human I've ever met," he said. She shook her head. "I didn't do this alone." "No," he agreed. "But you chose how it ended." That night she slept without dreaming for the first time in years. The Empire learned many lessons from that day. Some official, most unspoken. They learned that humans do not break the way others expect. That grief does not make us fragile, it makes us precise. That mercy, when chosen freely, is more destabilizing than cruelty. And they learned one final thing, whispered in backrooms and secure channels long after the broadcast faded. If a human loves someone, do not take them, ***, because humans will wait. And when they move, they will decide exactly how much of you survives. She never sought power after that. Never joined a cause. Never spoke publicly again. But across the galaxy, whenever an oligarch hesitated before ordering an execution, whenever a house reconsidered exploiting someone it believed invisible, whenever a tyrant chose restraint instead of spectacle, her shadow was there, not as a threat, as a reminder.